I know that you spent a lot of your early career as a police reporter. I kind of want to get an idea from you as to what drew you to that discipline, and how would you say that it influenced your later work at the Metro Desk?
There is an bottomless fascination about crime from readers. It's as old as the interest in crime is as old as crime itself. And I wanted to do stories that readers wanted to read. And in the 1990s, early 90s, at New York Newsday, when there were 2,000 homicides a year in New York City, that was the hot seat. And I wanted to be in the middle of it. And I covered roughly 300 murders in my 3 years covering the police department, some more in depth than others. And it was an incredible experience, but 3 years was quite sufficient. I can't imagine people who've done it for 20 years or more. It did become quite soul deadening after a while, but it was always fascinating, and it took me to all corners of New York City.
Wow. Okay.
I'm good at this, but this
Second
will be
question.
easy. Don't worry, this will be good.
Yeah, that's great. Second question: how was the transition from reporting to editing?
It was great because I learned that I'm a much better editor than I am a reporter. And I realized that I didn't miss having my own byline at all because I was so proud of the stories written by others that I got to be involved in. And there was no greater feeling than having a great idea for a story and then handing it to a reporter who I knew would do a better job than I ever would. And then sitting back and letting he or she do all the hard work and then deliver a story that I could feel a great deal of pride of ownership in because I had helped conceive it. Also after 10 years standing out in snowstorms and outside police precincts or on the hottest day of the year, it was nice to come into the office.
Got it. And then to you, what does being the leader of a journalistic team mean?
It means inspiring talent and then getting out of the way. It means listening to everyone's ideas and embracing them. It means sometimes having to force your vision over the objections of others. But it really, if you're lucky enough, as I was, to run the Metro Desk of the New York Times, where there is just an incredible amount of wealth of talent and knowledge, it really is just helping people be the best that they can be.
Great. Say you were to advise a recent college grad who wants to break into investigative journalism. What advice or warnings would you give them?
The advice I would say is write, write, write. I don't care if it's your school paper, form your own blog, local community newspaper. Write, 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 because you have to learn to write in what I call it the zen of writing, where you no longer think about the words. You have a story to tell, and that story goes straight from your brain to your prose without thinking about how do I describe this, how do I describe that. It comes naturally. And to do that, you have to write and write and write. More advice I would also give to anyone who wants to be an investigative journalist is you're young, and so make friends with people in other worlds who are young prosecutors, young detectives, young politicians in any realm. And as you work up and get older, so will they. And they will trust you and know you. And they will eventually become people in positions of power and authority, as will you, theoretically. And you'll know them. You'll never know when some 10-year-old friendship will suddenly yield the story of your life. Make friends, keep friends. The warning, I would say, is that, this business is in a very tough moment right now. And it's very tough to see how certain investigative journalists will be able to thrive in an environment with so many cutbacks occurring. And unfortunately, to many journalists, managers of newspapers, the investigative journalists are the first to go because they have to fill their report every day. And investigative journalists are a luxury. They could take a year to do a really great story. But I would argue that in these days, that is actually what should be the priority. because the investigative journalists are the ones who can really move the needle and bring the readers.
That's fascinating. When you say write as advice for college grads, what kind of things are you talking about writing?
Anything.
Anything in general?
Anything to get, but to tell stories. I mean, let me modify that a little bit. Write, and read. I mean, the goal is to just be able to tell a story effectively and cleanly and develop your own voice, and that takes years. So let's get started right away. And you can read, of course, newspapers and magazines, but also read, the great writers in history. Some of my favorite authors are Somerset Maugham, Truman Capote, and Christopher Isherwood, for example, who I'm not very interested in this necessarily what they have to say as much as I'm interested in how they say it. They're beautiful, clean, yet flavorful sentences. And Truman Capote said writing should be as clear as a country creek or something like that. And to learn that kind of elegant, simple writing and use it in journalism is great and is something you can do. And so read the great authors. Those happen to be my favorites. There are many, many others out there. Read the great authors and look at their prose. I'm reading a great book right now called let me just get it out, and called Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, M-I-N, new word J-I-N, new word L-E-E. And it's a novel, and it's sort of a sweeping historical novel, but the writing is so simple and elegant, and it doesn't get in the way of the story. Never let your writing get in the way of the story. Never let the reader say, "Wow, that's an interesting way to describe a rainstorm," because then you've suddenly taken the reader out of that rainstorm and made them conscious of the fact that they're reading words on paper.
That is an interesting point. Yeah.
Do me a favor, just mention her. I mentioned all men, and I'd want to obviously want to be very diverse in my people I cite. So if you could make sure that if you mention that, if you want to use that answer and cite actual authors, make sure she's in there too. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Got it. Will do. Next question. Your nonfiction work speaks to a deep love for and interest in New York City. What inspires that?
I grew up here. New York City, to me, is the center of the world. To me, it's the most exciting city there is, and I admit I have never lived anywhere else except for 3 years of college in Boston and 1 year in Paris. I don't pretend to be an expert in the great capitals of the world, but I just love New York. I love the subways. I love the people. I love the attitude. And it's interesting because I've seen so much change that I feel as though I've actually lived in multiple cities in my life, because the New York of today is so incredibly different than the New York I grew up in the 1970s. It's mostly better. But some flavor has been lost, and so it's been very fascinating to me to experience those changes and get from time to time to write about them.
Yeah, that's great. Your family has a prominent place in your work. You've written Father Knows Less, a family travel playbook. How would you say that they have influenced you as a writer?
They haven't so much as influenced me as provided me with great material. Family dynamics and family stories, everyone has them, and they're great. And you just have to keep your eyes and ears open for the great story. My wife, Helene Stupinski, wrote a great story the other month in the Times about following our daughter's Instagram account. And it was just something that was there in our daily life. And that's a great lesson for anyone who wants to be a journalist or a writer. There are great stories everywhere right in front of your face. You don't necessarily have to investigate and dig through paperwork and meet sources on the dark edge of town late on Sunday night to get a great story. Sometimes you do, but there are other great stories that are just there waiting to be embraced. And the family is the most basic one of those. They're right here in the room with me. They say funny things. Children are wonderfully filled with ideas, And it's a universal experience, right? Everyone's either been a child or had a child. So everyone gravitates towards those sort of stories, and it's just fun. It's fun, and I'm also proud that it's sort of a legacy I'll leave for them. They have, between my wife's writing and my writing, they have a pretty good accounting of their years so far on Earth.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. And as I understand it, you're orienting away from traditional journalism and towards strategic communications. Could you tell me more about what you intend to do?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I am fascinated by the use of journalism and high quality journalism in a more private sector. That is to say, one very interesting job I had recently is I produced a white paper on human trafficking for a firm that was interested in, being involved in fighting this problem, and they needed a high quality journalistic report basically on this problem, various examples of it, where it was bad, what was being done. So I used all the tools that I would use as a journalist and a writer to make that paper, yet I'm doing it for a communications firm and not a journalism institution. I didn't sugarcoat anything, I didn't have to change anything. So that to me is sort of the dream assignment. How can I use real journalism in different ways in today's world where many of the walls that used to exist between journalism and communications and public relations and marketing are becoming much more porous. Um, and while, of course, maintaining my dignity and my reputation as a good journalist.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to backtrack a bit, could you tell me a little more about how the events at Sandy Hook pushed you to enter strategic communications?
You know, um, it's more that they pushed me to consider a change from daily journalism. Um, it, it was such an awful story. You know, there's a thing for a journalist where sometimes what you think of as a great, exciting story is for someone in the world a tragic story. And this is just one of the things about the business. This was a case where it was so tragic that I had no joy or anything reporting this story. From the first moment we started hearing stirrings that something like this had happened, I inwardly just hoped and hoped it was untrue for these parents, for these kids, and for myself. It seemed like too much of an awful story for me to face. It happened. We did a very good job. We worked very hard on it. I was professional, but I started thinking, maybe it's time for something new. This is just too ghastly.
Yeah, tough situation. Um, Transitioning a bit here, what project or professional accomplishment would you say you're most proud of?
Portraits of Grief. These were the profiles of those who died at the World Trade Center. I edited the whole series. I personally edited roughly 2,000 of 2,400 of these profiles, and it became a real bulletin board for New Yorkers and a place to share our shock at 9/11. And so, in a way, I was given an opportunity in a very small way to help New York heal um, that day. And so I think that'll be, in the long run, my proudest journalistic accomplishment. I would say second
Yeah,
to that would be the coverage that I pushed on 2017 of the New York subways falling apart, because I believe that coverage in the Times really led to universal realization of this disaster and prompted other news organizations to come in with all they had, which was great, and prompted the officials in New York and New York State, New York City, New York State, to finally acknowledge this problem and start doing something about it.
yeah, and if I may add on the Portraits of Grief, not only did you allow New York even a little bit to heal, but you really even allowed the rest of the country to maybe even just capture a little glimpse of what New York was going through. That was a fascinating read for sure.
Well, that's great for you to say that. Yeah, exactly. Exactly my point. It was more than just. It became something bigger than just telling stories of people's lives, although it was that too.
Right, absolutely. Let's talk about your other two books, and maybe we'll start with Father Knows Less. I know that Father Knows Less, and I know that New York by New York are very different. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what inspired you to pursue them, and how the writing experience differed.
Well, it was being in the right place at the right time. I did a story. My son asked me funny questions. Daddy, am I allergic to metal? Daddy, what would hurt more, getting run over by a car or getting stung by a jellyfish? And over a couple of years, I made notes of his silliest questions. And then I had an idea to get the questions answered by actual adult experts. So, like the head of pain management at New York Hospital answered the car crash, running over by a car, jellyfish question. And I did a story in the Times about it just for fun. And I got a lot of book interest. A lot of publishers and editors and agents called me. So I decided to do a book, and it was just one of those things. And it was great fun and a great joy. And it was a similar thing with New York by New York. Martine Esseline, the publisher of Esseline, saw some stories I wrote. She had an idea she wanted to do about New York City, and she called me, and I took the job, and it was just fun. So I didn't really set out to do books. They kind of came my way. Um, so it was sort of a little side project, and I have other ideas for things that I might want to do in the future, but right now I'm not really focusing on it. But it was a great joy, both of them. And I had great experiences with the publishers in both cases too, which is, I think, unusual. Authors always complain about how little attention they got or how much little help they got. I felt very well treated in both cases.
Yeah, that's great. Are you looking to write any more books in the near future?
Not in the near future, but I have ideas. I have ideas.
Can I ask what those ideas are?
One I'm toying with is that it turns out that I've had people in my family fight in every war, in every American war since the French and Indian War in the 1750s. And so I'm wondering if there's a narrative through thought, where I could tell the story of one family being in every war. But that would take a great deal of research. So I'm just starting to think about how that would work.
As a history lover who is fascinated with the narrative of history, I can say that that would be an amazing book.
It's a good
If you
idea,
ever
right?
decide to write.
I know. It's a good idea. It's an awful lot of work. I mean, I'd have to really set aside a year to do that book, but I've definitely given a lot of thought. And I could go to all the battlefields, and there were deaths, obviously, people who died in extended family. I mean, it would be cousin died in Vietnam and stuff like that. It would be and my great uncle died in the Pacific. So there would be some travel involved, but yeah, it's just a little seed in my head right now.
If it ever comes around, I will be the first one to buy that book.
Okay, good. Good.
What topics have you always been interested in writing about, but maybe
Well,
never had
history.
a chance?
History. I was always very fascinated by World War II when I was growing up. I've also had a great lifelong interest in Japanese history and culture. I've studied kendo, which is Japanese fencing, and I've traveled there many times and tried miserably to learn to speak Japanese. I'm terrible at languages, but history or something along those lines is something I would love to, or any sort of very juicy historical narrative, some great tale of World War II that's never been told would be an exciting project for me.
Yeah, that sounds exciting. And would you ever consider writing fiction?
I would consider it. I've tried some short stories. I mean, I just don't think I'm all that good at it. But if the right plot pops into my head, at 3 in the morning, I would certainly have a go.